I'm Laurence Llewelyn-Bowen, and I'd like to offer you a pride of place seat on my tour bus of taste, taking in stops like history, culture, and alchemy of interior design. Our final destination this time is Gothic, the great survivor. Now, I know what you're like. I know that what you want more than anything is to join me as we push through the black-dyed, back-combed fringe of goth, just to see what's on the other side. Is gooey eyeliner, thrash metal, and emo angst all that we can expect from the term Gothic? Actually, what's so very clever about the word is that, like Doctor Who, goth regenerates itself for a totally new look from generation to generation. So our current definition of Gothic, okay, it has a lot in common with previous iterations, but it uses up more own brand hairspray from Boots than any iteration before. Basically, punks who refuse to grow up, the goths that convene in Whitby, why Whitby? Read Dracula for the answer. Or who so politely open the door for you outside Waitrose want to mark themselves as obviously as possible as outsiders in society. And that would chime perfectly with those of a Gothic persuasion in the 1780s, but be in violent opposition to the Gothicists of the 1850s. Meanwhile, Gothic folk of the 1330s were far too busy doing a lot of dying from the Black Death. And then the Gothlings of the 1290s, they were preoccupied with inventing Gothic in the first place. And then there are the Goths of the 450s. Well, they were the real card-carrying, says Goth on their passport Goths, and they were to be found doing their best to stamp out nice, polite, classical civilization. So, let's bid farewell to Gothic's 21st century adherents. Bye-bye Harry Potter obsessives. Au revoir Cher's mail-order goth home furnishing catalogue, and ta-ra to anyone who wears a top hat, fingerless gloves, more than 3 belts, and a lot of baby powder to sort out the inevitable chafage that only vegan leather jeans will engender. Let us go back to the days when Gothic, far from being a sartorial protest, a nerd interest, or a celebrity lifestyle choice, when Gothic actually represented the moral majority, and when Gothic became the evangelical architectural symbol of Imperial Britain. Which is why Gothic, a medieval building style indigenous to Northern Europe, finds itself in the oddest places. From Australia to India, Malaysia to Canada, spires, crockets, gargoyles, and above all pointed arches abound beneath tropical skies, in alien climates, in countries that the craftsmen of the Middle Ages didn't even know existed. Terra incognita. Victorian Gothic, like graffiti and discarded chewing gum, reaches every corner of each of the 4 continents. Now, believe it or not, the bombastic Victorians were actually quite insecure. British might was relatively parvenu. It only really starts getting going in the 1720s, and for the Victorians of the 1820s, that was far too close for historical comfort. But what they could do was actually make sure that everything looked a lot older. And when the Houses of Parliament burned down in 1834, well, the perfect opportunity to architecturally rebrand Britain with a building that gave its political system a look of history that reached far further back than the reality. And so the debate started. What flavour of older were we going to pick? Should it be rebuilt in classical garb as if the Romans had never left, all nicely entogaed, and who doesn't love a column? But the ultimate winner was the crockety Gothic hulk that we know so well today. Looking a bit like Dracula's piano lying on its back, the building work was done by Sir Charles Barry, whilst all of the twiddly bits, they came from the drawing board of Augustus Pugin, who obsessed over every last little stocking, snagging bit of carving. No surprise he died young, sucked dry, exsanguinated by his architectural obsessiveness. Every chair, every dado rail, every loose seat, and even the jewels to be worn by the MP's wives on opening day, they all came from Pugin's weaponised Gothic quill. The new Queen, Victoria, and her even newer husband, Albert, they loved it. For them and for the bourgeoisie, it ushered in a new world order, moral, upright, Christian. The opposite of the lascivious, luxuriously indulgent, and amoral neoclassicism of her predecessor, naughty George IV and his Regency taste. Ultimately, though, the joke was on the Brits. There wasn't a Gothic precedent in Britain that could be considered grand enough, twiddly enough, or in fact man enough for the job. So Pugin went, of all places, to Belgium for inspiration, which makes Big Ben a perfect example of Poirot Gothic. The Great Exhibition in 1851 locked and loaded Gothic as the country and therefore the empire's favourite style for municipal magnificence. Now, before we go further, let's lift the bonnet on Gothic and kick its tyres, shall we? The term Gothic is first documented in a letter by that pin-up of the Renaissance, Raphael Sanzo di Urbino, Urbino by name and smoothly urbane by nature. In it, he is deriding the sharpness and the barbarity of German, i.e. Gothic, building styles. So Gothic, for him, was the antithesis of the serenity and balance of the Renaissance, the revived Roman classicism that surrounded him and that he loved. Now, Gothic's a bit of an architectural phenomenon. It doesn't quite spring up overnight, but certainly within a generation, which is super speedy in terms of architectural history, take my word for it. And maybe one guy invented it, or maybe a group of builders evolved it, but it's so much more revolutionary in architectural terms than I think you realise. So a Gothic building, in this case Chartres Cathedral, which was the first, isn't actually a building at all. It's a skeleton. Before Gothic, buildings were boxes, and they had holes for windows and holes for doors. The Romans pioneered the use of arches, which meant that their roofs could span much further, which left much more room below for bathing or templing or palacing. The Roman round arches were clever, but they relied on super thick walls between them to literally do the heavy lifting. Now, a Gothic building is much, much more evolved. It's actually a frame of arches, and they get arranged next to each other in a line to make a wall, and then at right angles to each other to span the space between the two walls to support a ceiling. And the innovation that really made this happen was the fact that the arches are no longer round, the arches are pointed. Now, it might be that the pointed arch came to Chartres from Islamic Spain, because at that time they were using pointy as a decorative motif. But the fiendishly clever innovation behind a pointed arch is that it shrugs the weight of the building off much more efficiently. So efficiently that the space between the pointed arches, or inside the pointed arches, didn't need to be cumbersome, thick, load-bearing wall. It could be decorated stonework. It could be more arches fitting into each other like Russian dolls. Or, and it's a very big or, it could be window. Big, bright, colourful windows like the gaze of God breathing light and life into the magnificent interior. The Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, thanks to its pointed arch technology, becomes an enormous glazed jewellery box of a building. The other benefit of the Gothic arch is height. And it's height that really starts to define the Gothic look. Towering, glowering, spiky icebergs of Gothicism spring up in chilly cities all over the frigid north of Europe, like lightning conductors of faith, focusing God's attention down onto the congregation that cower within. Or, as some would have it, the other way round. They're like spire-studded Jacob's ladders, giving the faithful a bunk up to heaven. France got very good at Gothic. So good, there are corners of medieval Europe where it was known as the French style. They made it live with flickering carvings of super delicate foliage, hence the term flamboyant. Flamboyant, literally, their Gothic arches were on fire. Most of what we know about this style comes from what survives in churches, but yes, it did make it to the home for sure, and we can get a stylised glimpse of how it must have looked at the top end of the market in illuminated manuscripts. Sometimes you get a bit of art, like this, the statue of the Lady Uta from Nuremberg Cathedral, and this breaks through Gothicism's standard conventions, the conventions that restricted how nature was to be depicted and sucked them of their movement and their life force. She, however, is every bit as beautiful, as naturalistic, and as eloquent as her forebear Nefertiti. Britain does come to the Gothic party rather late, inheriting most of its expertise from the fact that our monarchs were actually French. Now, you like this. I love this drawing of the setting out room floor at York Minster. So this is a map of the incisions on the plaster floor that no longer exists. This is what the original masons used to make the arches that they followed when they were carving them. And you can see the exact geometry that they created. You can see the way that each compass point is driven into the floor. And you can see how they used circles, meeting and meeting and meeting to create these enormous, very, very intricate arches which still exist at the Minster. In Gothic terms, Britain might have been a slightly late developer, but by the time that Henry VIII extended Westminster Abbey to make room for a chapel in which to pray for the soul of his dead dad, we started doing something quite innovative. This is called perpendicular Gothic, and this is a much more modern take on Gothic. It's much taller, it's about rhythm, there's an almost classical obsession with getting a sense of serenity and balance. Arches are a lot flatter, columns are a lot taller, so rather than entering an enchanted forest, it's beginning to feel much more like a building. In the middle is Henry VII himself, and this tomb was made by the bloke who broke Michelangelo's nose at school, which gives you a very good sense of where we are in terms of history. When this chapel was built, Italy had been doing the Renaissance for 100 years. Leonardo still hadn't finished the Mona Lisa, and Raphael was slagging off Gothic in that letter. But Britain, far from embracing the Renaissance, was actually going to be another 100 years before it got its first truly classical, first top-to-toe Renaissance building. It's like, do you know what? It's like we were hooked on Gothic. What we did was we just kept refining our own particular perpendicular style. We added more and more, made it fiddlier and twiddlier. And I suppose, if nothing else, after Henry VIII told the Vatican to stuff it, we're going to create our own religion, our good old-fashioned, homegrown British Gothic could be seen as a kind of blokey opposite to all of that effete, neoclassical, Romish, popish malarkey of the Renaissance. A sentiment our Victorian forebears could gently applaud. So, Britain's first classical style building with columns and stuff happens in the 1620s. It's Inigo Jones's banqueting house in Whitehall. Eye-catchingly original as it was, it didn't actually start a classical contagion. Actually, late Gothic, and okay, there might be a few diet classical details, but late Gothic continues to thrive. Even Sir Christopher Wren, purveyor of ordered classicism to Charles II, sneaks in a few Gothic riffs every now and again into some of his post-Great Fire churches. And let's face it, look at those bell towers on St Paul's Cathedral. They've got a very strong cathedral-like feel to them. Here is Westminster Abbey. Surely it's monumentally medieval. Yeah, mostly, but not those twin towers with their Gothic Baroque optional extras. They were added by Hawksmoor, Wren's assistant, in the 1720s. Phew, my, how Gothic is clinging on. In fact, by the 1750s, it's well and truly back out of the closet again. Round about then, gossipy tastemaker Horace Walpole, well, he fell in love with what he called the gloomth of Gothic. He was inspired by long, probably pissed evenings, hanging out with bromantic mates at Berkeley Castle, and he decided he wanted to build himself a bit of Gothic. Strawberry Hill House treats Gothic with an antiquarian respect, although none of the architectural details are structural just as well, since the weight-bearing power of those pointed arches couldn't be relied upon in a crisis, since they're made of papier-mâché. With the firelight gently flickering in his self-authored gloomth, Horace Walpole sat down to write the first so-called Gothic novel, a nightmarish medieval schlocky horror, but it did pave the way for the powerful, sexy prose and poetry that came later: Vathek, Otranto, Frankenstein, and Byron's Don Juan. Gothic, with its ruins and mists and ghostly chanting monks, it becomes a style focus for the outsiders and the romantics of the 1780s, and it stays with them well into the turn of the next century. It was the opposite of the ordered, organised Georgian society that surrounded them. It was wild, it was sexy, it was overheated, and it was opposed to the polite, codified meekness that hang like a socially controlling cloud over Bath, Cheltenham or Belgravia, which is why I'm always surprised by our contemporary Goths and the fact that they are constantly going back to Victorian Gothic for stylistic inspiration. Victorian Gothic, a style that's about empire, that's about Britannia, that's about Edward Elgar. Surely they would be better off looking to their Georgian forebears for something that is Gothic, but something that is mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Aside from the goth nightclubs, the screaming vegan cafes, and the number 7 counter of Boots where you can buy guyliner, what happened to Gothic in our own time? Obviously, the 20th century used it with relish for films, but they also loved it for cinemas. Randolph Hearst plundered Europe's palaces for it and then re-erected it in Hollywood so that he could be called the king of his castle as well as being the dirty rascal. But you know what? Gothic never truly left the building. Because that pointed arch is so iconic, because at its heart, Gothic is about belief. Modern designers, well, they might throw out everything else when designing a church, but it seems they all decided you just can't beat a pointed arch as a beacon of worship. From the reverently elegant work of George Pace at Llandaff Cathedral, which I absolutely love, to the new so-called cardboard cathedral in the centre of earthquake-ravaged Christchurch, New Zealand, arches are springing up all over. And what about the Gothic of the future? Well, there's a fire. There's another fire, which is offering a phenomenal architectural opportunity for Gothic to evolve again. But will Paris actually follow through with the sheer, gorgeous Gothic bravery as some of the new proposal for Notre Dame's new roof? I would love to think so. There we are. So now you know, as I know, that Gothic truly does have a point to it. Bless you.